Hi, it's Keith from the Evangelical Free Church Stony Stratford, and we're continuing our series of short talks in the Gospel of Luke. And today we're looking at Luke chapter 6, verses 27 to 36. Jesus is continuing to teach, and last week we were looking at how he was talking about not putting one's faith in the things of the world, but rather putting one's faith in God and his kingdom. But what he says next really ups the stakes. There's a story about the famous Victorian preacher Charles Haddon Spurgeon preaching on Acts 17 verse 6. And that's where people come to the authorities to accuse the Apostle Paul and Silas of causing disturbance because they say this: these are the men that have turned the world upside down. Spurgeon started his sermon by saying, the world is the wrong way up to start with. And what Jesus teaches here turns the teaching of the world, the way the world expects people to react, completely on its head. Jesus is teaching in a way which exaggerates. This is what the rabbis of the day used to do. They used to use extreme forms of teaching, and Jesus does that. There's a time when he's talking about eradicating sin, and he says, well, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. He doesn't mean it literally, but he says, do something radical. It requires radical spiritual surgery. And he does that here. In verse 27, he says this, but I tell you who hear me, love your enemies and do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you and pray for those who ill treat you. And he goes on to say that if someone strikes you on the cheek, turn your other cheek to them. Now, the Bible actually has a lot to say about law and rights. But Jesus is using this extreme example to say this is an attitude. This is the kind of attitude you should have. Do the opposite of what the world expects. He actually quotes, or practically quotes, Leviticus 19 verse 18, when he says in verse 31, do to others as you would have them do to you. The point he's making is this. This isn't about giving up one's rights. As I said, the Bible has a lot to say about rights. But it is about not looking for revenge. After all, think about it. Where does it go when we have a grievance and we mull over it? And we think how we want to get even with anyone? Does it actually do us any good? Well, my experience, I would think it does no good at all. Just chews us up inside, makes us bitter people. Far better to forgive and move on. You see, Jesus then says something which is interesting. He basically says, if you act like the people of the world do, that's no big deal. After all, remember, he is teaching his disciples here. Verse 32 to 33, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. In other words, so what if you use the ethics or behaviour of the world? You do good to the people who do good to you. You're friendly with the people who are friendly to you. Basically, he's saying, so what? That's no big deal. And he actually sums it up by saying, think how God is with us. Verse 35 and 36. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you'll be sons of the Most High, because he is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. You see, this is the interesting thing, isn't it? When we rebelled against God, did God hold a grudge? Our sin had to be dealt with, yes. But it wasn't that he sort of cast us out and started again. The Apostle Paul sums this up very well in his letter to the Colossian church. And in chapter 1, verse 21 and 22, he says this: "Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behaviour. But now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation." What's that actually saying? Well, it's saying when we were dead in our sin, when we chose to rebel against God, we were as far from him as we could have been. It wasn't that we were sort of slightly offline. We were alienated. We were enemies in our minds. It's no good saying we didn't have anything against God. No, we were actively rebelling against him. But here's the thing. We've been reconciled to God through the cross of Christ. Through his death, we can now be presented holy in his sight and free from accusation, without blemish, without any stain on us that our sin and rebellion would cause. Now, I don't know what you think about that, but I think it's remarkable that a holy and perfect God would go to that trouble for imperfect people, that through the cross, as it says in 2 Corinthians 5:21, we can be given a righteousness. Are you going to be a person who wants to get right with God? Or are you going to trust in your own righteousness? I can assure you, your own righteousness, my righteousness, would never come up to God's standards. Put your faith in Jesus. He's paid the price that you can be reconciled with God and have peace with God and enjoy an eternity with God. Thank you so much for listening.